Mrs. Finch refused to give my brother his inhaler. During a life-threatening asthma attack, she thought he was faking it. When I confronted her, she said, "I'm protecting your family from a custody battle." I pushed past her to save him. That was 4 months ago. Yesterday, she was sentenced to prison. My parents left for their anniversary dinner around 6 p.m. The babysitter seemed normal at first. Mrs. Finch, from the agency. 5-star reviews. She even brought homemade cookies. My parents reminded her about Tommy's preventative inhaler at 8 p.m. Don't let him have it early, they said. He'll try to get out of homework. They meant his Flovent, his daily maintenance one, not his rescue inhaler, obviously. Tommy and I were playing tag in the backyard when it started. That tight wheeze. I know that sound. I'm his sister. I know that sound. Mrs. Finch, Tommy needs his rescue inhaler. She looked at me like I was trying to pull something. Your parents specifically said no inhaler until 8 p.m. That's his other inhaler. This is an emergency. She pulled out her phone, showed me mom's text. Tommy's inhaler at 8 p.m. Don't give in if he asks early. See, she said. I'm following instructions. Tommy was getting worse. Sitting on the couch now, pale, pulling at his collar like it was choking him. I texted mom frantically. Nothing. Called dad. Voicemail. My phone was at 7%. Mrs. Finch started Googling on her phone. How to tell fake asthma from real asthma. She read out loud. Children often hyperventilate from anxiety. She grabbed a paper bag from the kitchen, tried to put it over Tommy's mouth. For his breathing. Stop. That's for panic attacks. Tommy's whole body was working to breathe now. Stomach muscles, shoulders heaving up and down. He sounded like a broken whistle. She called her supervisor. Put it on speaker. The woman's voice filled our kitchen. Never deviate from parent instructions. You're liable if something happens. Mrs. Finch nodded. See? I'm doing the right thing. Tommy tried to walk to us. His legs gave out. He dropped to his knees. Crawled 2 feet. Stopped. Mrs. Finch rushed over. He needs to sit upright. My nephew has asthma. She forced him into a kitchen chair. Wouldn't let him lean forward even though that's what helps him breathe. My phone died. She opened all the windows. Fresh air helps, but it was freezing. Cold air makes asthma worse. Everyone knows that, right? Next thing I knew, I found mom's essential oils. Eucalyptus. This helps breathing. She started rubbing it on his chest. Tommy broke out in hives immediately. His skin went red and bumpy. Oh, she said, excited like she'd solved something. It's an allergic reaction, not asthma. We need Benadryl. I'm calling 911. Her face changed. Your mother mentioned the custody situation with Tommy's biological father. One call about medical neglect and he gets full custody. Is that what you want? She texted someone, her nurse friend, showed me the response. Always follow parent instructions to avoid liability. A nurse agrees with me. Tommy threw up, just bile and spit. Nothing really came up because he couldn't breathe enough to properly vomit. Food poisoning. I knew it. She actually looked relieved. Started looking for Pepto-Bismol in the cabinets, called poison control. While she was explaining to them about bad chicken at dinner, Tommy slid off the chair. She tried to make him sip water. Hydration helps everything. He choked. Water came out his nose. She kept checking her watch. Just 32 more minutes. I'm saving your family from a custody battle. Tommy whispered something. I leaned close. His lips were blue. Like actually blue. Not pale. Blue. Please. A tear rolled down his face. That's when I lost it. I don't care what you think. He's dying. I ran for the medicine cabinet. She'd locked it earlier. The key was in her pocket. She jumped up and blocked me. You bitch! I am not losing another job because kids manipulated me. I tried to push past. She grabbed my wrists. Hard. You're hurting me. Stop being dramatic. Just like your brother. I kicked her. Right in the shin. As hard as I could. She doubled over and I grabbed the key from her pocket. Hands shaking so bad I could barely get the cabinet open. She lunged for the inhaler. That's assault. I'm calling your parents. I dodged. Ran to Tommy. His lips weren't even blue anymore. They were purple. Purple turning gray. That's when I heard banging on the door. Thank God. I shoved past her and unlocked it. The neighbor only had to look at us for a few seconds before calling 911. Mrs. Finch was still talking. They said 8 p.m. I have it in writing. This is not my fault. I was protecting the family. The custody battle. The paramedics arrived in minutes. Felt like hours. They put Tommy on oxygen immediately. One of them turned to Mrs. Finch. How long was he like this? The parents said medicine at 8 p.m. I was following. Ma'am, the paramedic interrupted. This child was in severe respiratory distress. She pulled out her phone, shaking it at them. I have the text. They said 8 p.m. The other paramedic looked at it. This says preventative inhaler. You denied him his rescue inhaler? Through the window I saw them. Police cars. 2 of them. Mrs. Finch's face went white. The hospital waiting room lights made this awful buzzing sound that got into my head and wouldn't stop. I kept looking at the dried blood under my fingernails from where Mrs. Finch grabbed me. The automatic doors whooshed open and Mom came running through in her fancy anniversary dress with mascara all down her face. She grabbed me so hard it hurt. Where's Tommy? She was shaking me. The neighbor must have called them because she kept asking what happened and I couldn't get the words out fast enough. Dad burst through the emergency doors 8 minutes later with his tie all messed up and started grabbing every nurse he could find. Dr. Patel finally came out from behind these big metal doors and her face had that look doctors get when it's really bad. She told us Tommy had severe respiratory failure and they had him on a ventilator. Mom's legs just went and Dad had to catch her. We could see him through this little window with all these tubes and machines beeping and his chest going up and down, but it wasn't him breathing. It was the machine doing it for him. Officer Martinez pulled me aside to this quiet corner while my parents stayed pressed against that window watching Tommy. He had me go through everything from the beginning while writing in this little notebook. I showed him Mom's text on her phone and explained about the 2 different inhalers and how Mrs. Finch wouldn't listen. His jaw kept getting tighter the more I talked. Around 2 in the morning, Dad found me in the hospital chapel just sitting there shaking, and he kept saying it wasn't my fault and that I saved Tommy, but all I could think about was those purple lips and that whistling sound. We went for coffee at 6, and Mrs. Finch was right there in the lobby still wearing yesterday's clothes and talking on her phone about unclear instructions. She actually came over to us and started saying it wasn't her fault, and Dad stepped right in front of her and told her to stay away from us. Dr. Patel pulled us into this little room 2 hours later with Tommy's chart and started explaining about hypoxia and brain complications and how they wouldn't know anything until he woke up. She said the police would need her medical report because this was preventable. Then Child Protective Services showed up, but not for Mrs. Finch, for us, asking why we left unclear instructions and if we regularly left the kids with inadequate supervision. Mom completely lost it when they said that about the licensed agency with 5-star reviews. I sat with Tommy for hours that evening just holding his hand while the ventilator breathed for him. His little league trophy was on the nightstand, and I kept talking to him about his team winning even though he couldn't hear me. His hand twitched once, just this tiny movement, but it was the first thing in 20 hours. The next morning his eyes opened, but he looked right through us like we weren't even there. The neurologist ran all these tests with lights and reflexes while we waited outside. Tommy kept asking for his dog, but we don't have a dog and never have. Our lawyer met us in the cafeteria and went through the Guardian Angels agency contract page by page, showing us all these liability waivers. Mom pulled out her phone with the original text about the preventative inhaler, and he said criminal negligence overrides their waivers, but we needed to document everything. The lawyer gave us a checklist of things to save, and I spent the rest of that day taking photos of every text message and email while Mom sat with Tommy, who kept asking weird questions about our pets. 2 days later, Detective Morrison called and said I needed to come to the station for my official statement, so Mom drove me there and waited in the lobby while I sat in this small room with a recorder on the table. Morrison was younger than I expected with tired eyes, and he asked me to go through everything from the beginning, which took almost an hour because he kept stopping me to ask about exact words Mrs. Finch used. When he asked if she seemed drunk or confused, I told him no. She was completely sure she was right, and that was the scariest part because she really believed she was helping. By the time we got back to the hospital, Tommy was awake and recognized us, but he had these huge gaps in his memory, like he remembered playing tag, but nothing after that, until waking up with tubes in his nose. Dad hadn't left the room in 2 days, and kept holding Tommy's hand even when Tommy was sleeping like he was afraid to let go. The next morning, this woman showed up with a huge flower arrangement and introduced herself as Susan Whitfield from Guardian Angels Agency, and she had this fake smile while handing Mom a folder. Mom read the papers out loud, and it was basically asking us to sign away our right to sue in exchange for them covering the medical bills, but when she got to the part about no admission of wrongdoing, Mom tore the whole thing in half. Susan's face went red and she started saying something about being reasonable, but Mom just pointed at the door until she left. An hour later, Dr. Patel came in with his official report, and I'll never forget the words because Mom made him repeat them 3 times. Talk about a babysitter who takes following instructions to a whole new level of wrong. She'd probably refuse to give water to someone on fire if the text said, no drinks until dinner time. Severe hypoxic brain injury narrowly avoided. Oxygen deprivation for 25 to 30 minutes. Survived due to age and previous healthy condition. Permanent damage unlikely but possible. The insurance company called that afternoon while we were eating cafeteria sandwiches, and Dad put them on speaker so we could all hear the woman saying they were investigating whether we failed to provide adequate care instructions. Dad's voice got so quiet it was scary, and he said our son nearly died because a babysitter refused to give him life-saving medication, and you're questioning coverage while the woman kept repeating policy terms. That evening, a nurse came in to give Tommy his breathing treatment, and he completely lost it, screaming and crying that she wouldn't let him have it just like Mrs. Finch. I had to hold him while he sobbed and shook, and the child psychologist who came later wrote pages of notes about trauma response. The next morning, Detective Morrison called to say Mrs. Finch had hired a defense attorney who was claiming she followed industry standard protocols for medication administration, and he needed our original agency contract plus all our communications with them. He said she was telling everyone we were negligent parents who left unclear instructions, which made Mom throw her coffee mug against the wall. I went online that afternoon to check Guardian Angels Facebook page and found hundreds of 1-star reviews from angry parents, but also defenders saying parents need to leave clear instructions and babysitters aren't mind readers. Then I saw a comment that made my stomach drop from a woman saying Mrs. Finch let her diabetic daughter's blood sugar crash last year with the same excuse about following instructions. I screenshot everything and started messaging people, and within hours 3 other families had contacted Mom with similar stories about Mrs. Finch and medical emergencies. One kid's EpiPen withheld during an allergic reaction, another's seizure medication delayed, all with the same pattern of her saying she was following the parents' instructions. We got Tommy home that night, but he needed breathing treatments twice a day and couldn't go back to school yet, so his bedroom looked like a mini hospital with a nebulizer and oxygen monitor. I helped him with his breathing exercises, and he asked me why Mrs. Finch didn't help him, and I couldn't give him an answer that made any sense because there wasn't one. The next few weeks blurred together with hospital follow-ups and Tommy checking his peak flow meter every few hours like it might suddenly drop to 0 again. Mom spent hours on the phone with lawyers while Dad installed new locks on every door and window in the house. I caught him testing them at night, making sure nobody could get in without us knowing. Tommy started carrying his rescue inhaler everywhere, even to the bathroom, clutching it in his sleep until his knuckles turned white. The lawyer Mom found specialized in medical negligence cases, and his office walls were covered with newspaper clippings about kids who'd been hurt by caregivers. He spread out the hospital records on his conference table and pointed to Tommy's oxygen levels from that night, numbers so low the ER doctor had written critical 3 times and underlined it. On February 19th, he filed the civil suit against Mrs. Finch and Guardian Angels Agency for gross negligence, asking for damages to cover Tommy's medical bills and ongoing therapy. Within 4 hours, their insurance company's lawyers sent back a countersuit claiming we'd committed defamation by posting about the incident on Facebook, even though every word Mom wrote was true. Mom laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh, more like a bitter sound that came out wrong. That afternoon, the local news station called asking for an interview after someone leaked the lawsuit filing to them. The reporter showed up with a camera crew, and suddenly our front yard looked like a movie set with all the equipment and lights. Dad told them the basic facts while Tommy watched from his bedroom window, too scared to come downstairs when strangers were in the house. The segment aired that night with the headline, Babysitter Refuses Rescue Inhaler to Asthmatic Child, and our phone started ringing non-stop. More reporters came the next morning, some camping outside our house waiting for someone to come out and give them a quote. Dad bought security cameras and spent all day installing them, running wires through the walls and setting up monitors in his office. Tommy wouldn't leave his room when the doorbell rang, just sat on his bed holding his inhaler and watching his breathing treatment machine like it might disappear. The Facebook post Mom had written got shared thousands of times, and other parents started reaching out with their own stories about Mrs. Finch and Guardian Angels. Jennifer Walsh messaged first, said Mrs. Finch had refused to give her daughter insulin because she thought the girl was faking low blood sugar for attention, and the kid ended up in a diabetic coma for 3 days. Marcus Rivera's story was worse. His son had seizures, and Mrs. Finch held him down instead of calling 911 because she thought he was throwing a tantrum, and now the boy has permanent brain damage from lack of oxygen. instruction. They all came to our house on February 20th, 7 families total, carrying folders full of medical records and printed emails from the agency. We sat around the dining room table comparing timelines and realized Mrs. Finch had been doing this for at least 4 years, always protected by Guardian Angel's liability waivers that parents had to sign. Jennifer's daughter still wore a continuous glucose monitor that beeped every few minutes, and Marcus's son sat in a special chair because he couldn't hold himself up anymore. The pattern was clear in every case. Mrs. Finch decided the kids were faking or exaggerating, refused to give prescribed medications or call for help, and the agency backed her up every time with their following parent instructions defense. That afternoon, Tommy stood at his window watching kids walk home from school like he used to do before everything happened. His friend Alex waved up at him, but Tommy just stared, didn't wave back, didn't smile, nothing. Later, he asked me what would happen if he needed help again, and nobody believed him. And the child psychologist Mom had found said this kind of fear might stay with him forever. Another thing Mrs. Finch stole that we couldn't get back. Detective Morrison showed up on February 21st with news that made Mom grab Dad's hand so tight her knuckles went white. The DA's office had decided to file criminal charges against Mrs. Finch for reckless endangerment of a child, a felony that could mean actual jail time. But when Dad asked about the agency and Susan Whitfield, the detective shook his head and explained that corporate liability was harder to prove without evidence of systemic negligence. That's when Jennifer leaned forward and opened her folder, spreading out emails from Susan telling parents their children were manipulative and defending Mrs. Finch even after kids ended up hospitalized. The detective's eyes went wide as he read through them, especially one where Susan wrote that children often exaggerate symptoms to avoid responsibilities. 2 days after Marcus's son had his first seizure under Mrs. Finch's care, someone leaked Mrs. Finch's deposition video on February 22nd, and it spread across social media within hours. She sat there in a gray suit repeating the same words over and over like she'd rehearsed them, claiming she followed protocol, and that parents must provide clear instructions, and that liability falls on unclear communication. When the lawyer asked about Tommy turning blue, she actually said children often exaggerate symptoms for attention, said it with a straight face like a kid turning blue was something you could fake. The comment section exploded with parents sharing their own horror stories, and then someone found something that changed everything. Mrs. Finch's nursing license had expired in 2019, 3 years before she almost killed Tommy, but she'd been advertising herself as a child care professional with medical training the whole time. Guardian Angels never checked. Their background screening only looked for criminal records, not whether her medical credentials were real or current. Dad watched the video in his home office with the door closed, but we could still hear him yelling at the screen, calling Mrs. Finch names I'd never heard him use before. The protest at Guardian Angels headquarters on February 23rd started with just our 7 families but grew to almost 50 people by noon. Parents held signs with pictures from their kids' hospital stays, oxygen masks and IV lines and cardiac monitors, images that made passing drivers slow down and stare. Susan Whitfield came out with 2 security guards and tried to tell everyone we were just disgruntled clients seeking money, but Jennifer held up her daughter's insulin pump and said money wouldn't give back what the agency stole from their children. The local news live-streamed the whole thing on their website, and you could see Susan's face getting redder as more parents showed up with their own stories. Tommy watched from our car in the parking lot, gripping his inhaler so tight the plastic creaked, flinching every time someone mentioned Mrs. Finch's name. That night, he started sleeping in my room, dragging his blanket and pillow across the hall after Mom and Dad went to bed. He'd wake up gasping and grabbing at his throat like someone was choking him, then spend an hour doing breathing treatments he didn't actually need. Mom found him one morning at 6 a.m. on February 24th, sitting on my floor with a nebulizer mask on, even though the medicine cup was empty, just breathing in plain air from the machine because it made him feel safe. She sat down next to him and held his hand while he practiced breathing, and later she told Dad it was like Tommy was trying to prove to himself that he could still breathe, practicing for the next time someone might not believe him. Someone should tell Susan Whitfield that childcare professional with medical training usually means the training is still valid, not something that expired when flip phones were still cool. The nursing board opened their investigation on February 25th after getting flooded with complaints about Mrs. Finch practicing without a valid license. Turns out she'd been telling families she was a registered nurse for years after her license expired, and Guardian Angels had been advertising her as their medical expert for childcare, even though they never verified her credentials. The investigator found 17 more families who'd hired her specifically because they had kids with medical conditions and thought they were getting a real nurse. The agency's liability shield started cracking when their insurance company realized they might be on the hook for fraud charges, not just negligence. Then on February 26th at 2 p.m., Mrs. Finch showed up at our front door with her lawyer, demanding we stop harassing her and retract our statements about the incident. Tommy saw her through the living room window and his whole body went rigid. Then he started gasping and clutching his chest, a full panic attack that looked exactly like an asthma attack. I grabbed his rescue inhaler, but it didn't help because his airways weren't actually closed. His brain just thought they were because seeing her brought everything back. Mom called 911 while Dad stood in the doorway blocking Mrs. Finch from coming any closer, and she just stood there in our driveway watching the paramedics give Tommy oxygen. No emotion on her face at all, like she was watching a TV show instead of a kid she'd almost killed having a breakdown because of what she did. The paramedics kept Tommy on oxygen for 20 minutes while Mrs. Finch stood frozen in our driveway until a police officer finally told her to leave. Tommy slept in Mom and Dad's bed that night, his rescue inhaler clutched in his hand like a stuffed animal. 3 days later, an unknown number called Mom's phone while we were eating breakfast. The woman on the other end wouldn't give her name but said she used to work at Guardian Angels until last year. She had training videos from 2020 saved on her laptop that showed Susan Whitfield teaching new employees company policy. Mom put it on speaker, and we heard Susan's voice clear as day telling a room full of people to never give medicine without written permission from parents. The woman said Susan repeated this over and over in every training session, that following parent instructions was more important than anything else. She sent the videos to our lawyer's email that afternoon, 5 different recordings of Susan drilling this rule into her staff. The next day, Tommy had to go back to school with a new medical action plan that the nurse typed up and printed in triplicate. Everything seemed fine until third period when the substitute teacher saw him reaching for his inhaler during math class. She grabbed it from his desk and said kids shouldn't self-medicate without adult supervision. supervision, then walked it to her desk at the front of the room. Tommy started wheezing right there in his seat, but was too scared to say anything until his friend ran to get the nurse. The nurse came and gave him his inhaler, but by then Tommy was shaking and crying, not from the asthma, but from fear. The school called me to pick him up, and when I got there, he wouldn't let go of my arm in the parking lot. The principal met us at the door and suggested maybe Tommy would do better with homeschooling or online classes for a while. Mom went off on him right there in the hallway, asking if they were really trying to push out a kid for having a medical condition. 2 weeks passed before we got the letter about Mrs. Finch's trial date being set for August, which meant she'd be free for 6 more months. Mom was scrolling through Facebook that night when she saw a post in her parenting group about a great new babysitter in Millburn. The photo showed Mrs. Finch sitting on a couch with twin boys, big smile on her face like nothing had happened. Mom screenshot everything and called the number in the post, but the family had no idea about any charges against her. I started carrying my phone everywhere after that, recording every conversation with teachers, doctors, even the grocery store clerk who asked why Tommy looked so tired. Mom caught me recording her talking to Dad about lawyer fees, and instead of getting mad, she just nodded and said to keep doing it. The Millburn family called 3 days later, completely hysterical because Mrs. Finch had refused to give their twins their ADHD medication that morning. She'd told them the boys were being overdrugged, and that parents these days just wanted zombie children who wouldn't act like normal kids. They found our story online after she left because something felt wrong about how rigid she was about the medicine schedule. The mom was crying on the phone, saying Mrs. Finch had told them we were lying parents trying to get money from a lawsuit. They fired her immediately and wanted to join our case, and our lawyer said this helped prove a pattern of behavior. Our lawyer called the next morning with more news about guardian angels and their insurance problems over the years. 3 different insurance companies had dropped them in 5 years because of too many claims against the agency. They were using some high-risk insurance company now that barely covered anything, which explained why they kept trying to settle cases quietly. Every family who'd complained got offered the same deal, a small payment if they signed papers promising never to talk about what happened. We were the first ones to say no and go public with everything, which is why Susan was fighting so hard to discredit us. Tommy tried to go back to Little League practice that weekend, but couldn't run from first to second base without stopping to use his inhaler. His coach came to the house later to encourage him to keep trying, but Tommy just stared at his baseball glove and wouldn't talk. Later, he asked me what would happen if he needed help during a game, and the coach didn't believe him either. He quit the team the next day, another thing Mrs. Finch had taken from him without even being there. 3 days later, Susan got arrested when investigators found out 5 of her babysitters had fake or expired certifications. Dad was in the garage when Mom got the call, and he punched a hole right through the drywall when she told him Susan was already out on bail. The agency was still running like nothing had happened, still sending babysitters to families who had no idea what was going on. Tommy's school held an assembly about medical emergencies after 3 teachers admitted they wouldn't have known the difference between inhalers either. The school nurse brought both types to show everyone, explaining how one prevents attacks and one stops them when they're happening. Tommy sat in the back row with his hood up, trying to be invisible while everyone stared at him. His friend Alex told everyone at lunch that Tommy was basically a hero for surviving what happened, which was nice but didn't make Tommy feel any better. Then the real bombshell came when our lawyer got a call from people who used to work with Mrs. Finch at a hospital years ago. She'd been forced to resign in 2018 after repeatedly ignoring doctors' orders because she thought she knew better than them. One nurse said Mrs. Finch would change medication doses on her own, skip treatments she disagreed with, and argue with doctors about patient care. The hospital let her resign quietly instead of firing her, which meant she could keep working with kids through agencies that didn't check thoroughly enough. The news about her past made me so mad I couldn't sleep that night. April 2nd rolled around and I grabbed my phone to make a TikTok account called Kids Medical Rights. I filmed myself talking about how to spot the difference between preventative and rescue inhalers. Tommy showed his 2 inhalers to the camera and held them up side by side, the orange one for daily use and the blue one for emergencies. Within 24 hours, the video had 50,000 views. Comments started flooding in from kids whose parents didn't believe their stomach pain or whose teachers said they were faking headaches. 3 days later, we got a call from the state saying they were launching a formal investigation into childcare agency regulations. They wanted us to testify at a hearing downtown. Tommy said he'd speak, but when we got to the parking garage, he started shaking and couldn't catch his breath. Not asthma this time, but pure panic. I went in alone and stood at the microphone with my voice cracking. The room went totally quiet when I described that night. People actually clapped when I finished talking. April 12th brought another appointment with a specialist who confirmed what we already knew about Tommy. Post-traumatic stress disorder from watching adults ignore his medical emergency. The bills kept coming in thick envelopes that Mom would open at the kitchen table. $200,000 and climbing with therapy sessions not covered by insurance. Guardian's insurance company sent a letter offering $50,000 to settle everything. Mom threw it in the trash. 3 days later, Dr. Patel called and said she'd be our expert witness even though other doctors warned her not to get involved. She wrote a report saying the delay in giving Tommy his rescue inhaler was basically attempted manslaughter. My TikTok hit 100,000 followers by April 18th. Kids from all over were sharing their stories about adults who wouldn't listen. Tommy designed a logo for the account with a blue inhaler that had little wings on it. Dr. Patel helped me write a guide about advocating for yourself in medical emergencies. Then everything went sideways on April 22nd. Mrs. Finch went on some podcast and told the host she was a victim of woke parenting. She said Tommy was performing his symptoms and that I attacked her for no reason. The host agreed with everything she said and called us money-hungry parents trying to get rich off a lawsuit. Mrs. Finch showing up with a lawyer to demand they stop harassing her is like a burglar suing you for having locks on your doors. The nerve of some people really knows no limits. The video spread everywhere online. Tommy found it 3 days later when a kid at school showed him. He watched the whole thing without saying a word. That night he asked me if maybe she was right, and he had exaggerated how bad it was. The way she got into his head even months later made me want to scream. April 30th, we met with a prosecutor who said they were adding attempted manslaughter charges based on Dr. Patel's report, but she warned us that Mrs. Finch had worked with kids for 30 years without any complaints on her official record. Juries tend to side with older women who seem grandmotherly. We needed more families to come forward with their own stories. By May 5th, 14 families had joined a class action lawsuit against Guardian Angels. The company immediately declared bankruptcy to avoid paying anyone. But get this, they reopened the next week under a new name called Cherished Care Solutions. Same office, same staff, same policies, and Susan was still running everything. Dad hired a private investigator on May 10th after finding out about the reopening. The guy was expensive but had worked bank fraud cases before. Within 3 days, he found something crazy. Susan had moved $2.3 million to offshore accounts right before declaring bankruptcy. The investigator kept digging and found she was running 5 different babysitting agencies across 3 states, all with different names but the same terrible policies. Mom wanted to send everything to the FBI immediately, but our lawyer said we needed more proof first. Tommy started martial arts on May 15th because his therapist thought it might help with his anxiety. The sensei had asthma too and understood about keeping inhalers close. During the breathing exercises, Tommy actually smiled for the first time since that night. He wasn't the same kid anymore, but at least he was finding ways to cope. Our story started dividing people in town by May 20th. Some parents pulled their kids from Tommy's school, claiming we were lawsuit happy and destroying a good agency over nothing. Others started sharing their own horror stories about guardian angels. This mom cornered me at the grocery store and said I was ruining that poor woman's life over a misunderstanding. I left my full cart right there and walked out. Tommy's medical team decided to make a documentary about kids' medical rights on May 25th. They wanted Tommy to participate but promised to blur his face. Watching him act out that night with actors playing us was brutal. Mom had to leave the room when they got to the part where his lips turned blue. Dad's jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth would crack. Tommy kept saying other kids needed to know this could happen to them. The FBI finally raided Guardian's offices on May 30th after getting our evidence about the wire fraud. They arrested Susan on federal charges right in front of her employees. Mrs. Finch heard about it and immediately called the prosecutor offering to testify against the agency for reduced charges. The whole empire was falling apart, but Tommy still woke up gasping for air every night. Victory didn't feel like winning when your brother was still broken. Tommy got invited to his friend's pool party on June 10th, but wouldn't go near the water. He sat on the deck holding his inhaler watching the other kids play. When someone splashed water near him, he panicked and ran inside. He's 10 years old and scared of everything now. Mrs. Finch stole his childhood, and I can't forgive that. Her lawyer filed a motion on June 15th, claiming I was harassing her through social media. The judge watched all my TikToks in court while Mrs. Finch sat there looking smug. The judge said teaching kids to advocate for their medical needs wasn't harassment but a public service. Our first real legal win, and Mrs. Finch's face went white. We had our first family therapy session on June 20th, where we all talked about that night together. Tommy told us he thought he was dying and described the darkness creeping in from the edges. Mom sobbed so hard she couldn't breathe. Dad admitted he fantasized about confronting Mrs. Finch in person. I shared how guilty I felt about not calling 911 sooner, even though everyone said I did everything right. The state hearing on June 25th was packed with 23 families who used to use guardian angels. Each one told stories about medical neglect and dismissed emergencies and kids whose voices got ignored. The commissioner looked sick listening to everything. Susan's lawyer kept objecting to what he called inflammatory testimony, but the room actually laughed at him. The commissioner shut him down with one raised hand and announced the agency would be shut down while they did a full investigation. Susan's face went white when they said federal charges were coming. 5 days later, on June 30th, Mrs. Finch's neighbor called us. She'd been going door to door with a printed stack of papers telling everyone she was being persecuted for following parent instructions. The neighbor forwarded us the GoFundMe link where Mrs. Finch claimed she was a victim of cancel culture who needed help with legal fees. She'd already raised $30,000 from people who only heard her side of the story. Dad reported it to GoFundMe that same afternoon while Mom threw a coffee mug at the wall. The 4th of July was supposed to be fun, but the fireworks smoke hit Tommy hard. We ended up watching from our car with all the windows rolled up while his nebulizer hummed between us on the center console. He looked out at the other kids running around with sparklers and said he hated her. First time I'd heard him say anything angry instead of scared since that night. The therapist told Mom later it meant he was starting to process what happened to him. 5 days after that, the state passed emergency legislation requiring all childcare workers to complete training on the difference between maintenance and emergency medications. They called it Tommy's Law, which should have felt like a victory, but Mrs. Finch's lawyer went on the news calling it government overreach based on one misunderstanding. One misunderstanding like my brother almost dying was just a simple mistake anyone could make. The documentary finally aired on July 15th, and my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages. Some parents thanked us for educating them about medication differences they never knew about, but the hate mail came too, calling us crisis actors and money grabbers trying to get famous off a fake story. Mom deleted all her social media accounts that night, but I kept mine because someone needed to document what was really happening. The pre-trial hearing on July 20th was when Mrs. Finch's lawyer tried his stupidest move yet. He stood up and claimed she had dementia and wasn't mentally fit to stand trial. The prosecutor pulled out printed transcripts from 3 different podcast interviews she'd done, plus all her detailed GoFundMe posts explaining her side. The judge actually said selective dementia out loud and scheduled the trial for August 15th. Tommy had to practice his testimony on July 25th with the victim advocate in a small office that smelled like old carpet. He couldn't get through describing that night without reaching for his inhaler twice. They decided he'd testify by video from another room so he wouldn't have to see her face. The advocate kept saying it was to protect him from more trauma, but he was already having nightmares every single night. I went with Sarah on July 30th when she taught Tommy's friends what an asthma attack looks like. 10-year-old kids sitting in a circle learning to count breaths per minute and when to call 911. Alex raised his hand and promised he'd always believe Tommy even if teachers didn't, and they made a buddy system where someone would always be with him at recess. These were children teaching themselves emergency medicine because the adults had already failed them once. Susan's federal wire fraud hearing happened August 5th, and Mom made us all go to support the other families. She pleaded guilty and got house arrest with fines, but no actual jail time. The prosecutor said she'd probably be running another agency within 2 years once people forgot. Mom screamed so loud in the parking garage after that the security guard came running. We spent August 10th doing final trial prep with 17 witnesses ready to testify, including 3 medical experts who would explain how rescue inhalers work. Mrs. Finch had character witnesses who'd known her for years but never saw her during an actual emergency. Our lawyer kept saying juries are unpredictable, but the evidence was overwhelming. Then on August 12th, during jury selection, Mrs. Finch walked right up to Mom in the courthouse hallway. She leaned in close and whispered that she'd been protecting us from losing custody, and we should be thanking her. Mom's whole body started shaking, but she didn't swing even though I saw her fists clench. An officer stepped between them and told Mrs. Finch to maintain distance from the victim's family. She smiled at him and said she did nothing wrong before walking back to her lawyer. 3 days later, we sat in the courtroom for opening statements. The prosecutor stood up and clicked through slides on a big screen showing every minute of that night. She pointed at the timeline with a laser pointer. 32 minutes from when I first asked for Tommy's inhaler to when the paramedics arrived. 32 minutes of my brother suffocating while Mrs. Finch insisted she knew better than us. The defense lawyer stood up next and called it a tragic misunderstanding. He said my parents gave unclear instructions about which inhaler to use. I could see Tommy watching from the witness room through the glass door. He was clutching his inhaler so tight his knuckles were white. The defense calling it a tragic misunderstanding is like saying the Titanic had a minor ice cube problem, except this ice cube had 30 years of childcare experience and a law degree. That afternoon, they called me to testify first. I walked to the witness stand and my legs felt like jelly. The prosecutor asked me to walk through every minute of that night. I told them about Tommy's wheeze starting during tag, about Mrs. Finch refusing to give him his rescue inhaler, about her Googling fake asthma symptoms while he turned blue. The defense attorney stood up for cross-examination. He asked why I didn't call 911 right away if I thought it was so serious. I told him I was 14, and she was the adult who said she'd handled asthma before. He suggested I was exaggerating everything for the lawsuit money. I held up the crime scene photos showing my bloody fingernails from where I'd clawed at the locked medicine cabinet. The jury stared at the pictures. The next morning, the paramedics testified about finding Tommy. One of them described his lips being cyanotic, which means blue from lack of oxygen. His oxygen saturation was at 68% when normal is above 95. The paramedic said Tommy was minutes from death when they arrived. He broke his professional composure and said that in 20 years he'd never seen a caregiver refuse rescue medication during active respiratory failure. He called it unconscionable, which I had to look up later. Mrs. Finch sat there taking notes like she was in a business meeting. That afternoon, Dr. Patel showed the jury Tommy's brain scans on the screen. She explained how lack of oxygen affects the brain and pointed to areas that almost got damaged. She said another 5 minutes and we'd be discussing wrongful death, not child endangerment. Mrs. Finch's lawyer kept objecting to everything, but the judge let her continue. One juror started crying when she showed the comparison between normal brain scans and what Tommy's could have looked like. On day 3, they played Tommy's video testimony since he was too anxious to testify in person. His small voice filled the whole courtroom through the speakers. He described not being able to breathe and trying to tell Mrs. Finch he needed help. He said she told him he was faking and being dramatic. He said he thought he was going to die and never see us again. Halfway through the video, he had an anxiety attack and needed his nebulizer. The judge called a recess so everyone could compose themselves. Mrs. Finch muttered something about him being so dramatic, and 2 jurors turned to look at her. That afternoon, Jennifer and Marcus testified about their experiences with Mrs. Finch. Jennifer's daughter had a severe allergic reaction, and Mrs. Finch refused to use the EpiPen. Marcus's son had a diabetic emergency, and she wouldn't give him his glucose tablets. The defense objected, saying this was prejudicial, but the judge said pattern of behavior was relevant to intent. Mrs. Finch's confident face started to crack a little bit. On day 4, Mrs. Finch finally took the stand herself. She still insisted she followed protocol and did nothing wrong. She called all the families hysterical and said we were just after money. When the prosecutor showed her the video of Tommy's testimony, she actually said, children can be very convincing actors. The prosecutor asked if she still believed she did nothing wrong. She said absolutely nothing without any hesitation. During cross-examination, the prosecutor destroyed her completely. She showed Mrs. Finch's expired nursing license from 15 years ago. She showed paperwork from her dismissal from a hospital for not following emergency protocols. She played training videos about the difference between preventive and rescue inhalers. The prosecutor asked if she knew the difference between the 2 types of inhalers. Mrs. Finch said yes, but tried to explain. The prosecutor cut her off and asked if she chose not to give Tommy his rescue inhaler. Mrs. Finch said the parents told her not to. The prosecutor asked for a yes or no answer. Mrs. Finch said she followed instructions. The prosecutor asked again for yes or no. After a long pause, Mrs. Finch finally said yes. That evening, we all sat in Tommy's room waiting for closing arguments the next day. Tommy couldn't sleep and kept checking his inhaler was on his nightstand. We didn't talk much, but just sat there together. Dad held Mom's hand, and I held Tommy's hand. We were different people than we were 6 months ago. We were harder and more careful, but we were still here. The next morning, both lawyers gave their closing arguments. The defense claimed it was a good faith error and parental miscommunication. The prosecutor put the text message back on the screen showing Mom's message about Tommy's inhaler at 8 p.m. She explained how any reasonable person would know this meant routine medication, not emergency medication, during an active asthma attack. She said Mrs. Finch chose rigid protocol over a child's life. The jury left to deliberate, and we waited in that weird courthouse limbo where time doesn't work right. 27 hours they took. Mom paced the hallway wearing a path in the ugly green carpet, while Dad sat frozen on the bench checking his phone every 30 seconds, even though it never rang. Tommy stayed home with our aunt because the prosecutor said kids shouldn't have to sit through this part. I ate 12 bags of vending machine chips and threw up twice in the bathroom. When the bailiff finally called us back, my legs felt like water. Mrs. Finch stood up when the judge asked her to, still wearing that same smug face like she knew something we didn't. The foreman read from his little card, and I held my breath so hard I saw spots. Guilty of reckless endangerment of a child. Guilty of practicing without a valid license. She didn't even blink. Tommy was watching on the video link from home, and I saw him squeeze our aunt's hand so hard his knuckles went white. Mom collapsed against Dad's shoulder, and he held her while she shook. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks out, but then the prosecutor stood up and asked about bail. She showed the judge Mrs. Finch's social media posts from that morning, calling this a witch hunt, and saying parents were liars trying to get money. The judge's face got dark, and he denied bail right there. Mrs. Finch started screaming about persecution and demanding her supporters be heard, but the court officers were already moving. They put the cuffs on her, and she kept yelling all the way out the door about how she was saving children from manipulative families. Tommy's voice came through the laptop speaker so quiet we almost missed it. She can't hurt anyone else now. Outside the courthouse, the news crews were waiting like vultures. They shoved microphones at us, and Mom tried to shield us, but Tommy stepped forward. His voice was steady when he spoke, not like the scared kid from February who couldn't breathe. Kids need adults who listen. Susan. When we say we can't breathe, believe us. The reporter asked if he had anything to say to Mrs. Finch, and he just shook his head. The next morning, Susan's name was all over the news. Her agencies got shut down after the state pulled their licenses. 147 families came forward with complaints going back 8 years. Stories about babysitters who ignored allergies, who let kids wander off, who fell asleep on the job. The state announced an emergency fund for affected families, and suddenly our phone wouldn't stop ringing with other parents wanting to know how to file claims. 2 weeks later, we were back for sentencing. Tommy stayed at school this time because he had a math test, and he said he wanted to be normal for one day. The judge gave Mrs. Finch 3 to 5 years in state prison, plus a lifetime ban from working with children. Even while he read the sentence, she kept insisting she did nothing wrong. Your rigid adherence to perceived protocol over human life shows a dangerous lack of judgment, he told her. She just stared at him like he was speaking a different language. The civil case against the insurance companies started the next week, but they offered a settlement before we even got to opening arguments. $2.8 million. Our lawyer said we should take it because juries are unpredictable, and Tommy needed closure more than he needed a trial. The money would cover his therapy and medical bills and maybe college someday if he wanted it. Tommy surprised everyone by going back to his Little League field that September. He couldn't play anymore because his lungs were too damaged, but he wanted to help coach the younger kids. He taught them about asthma and made sure every single coach knew the difference between maintenance and rescue inhalers. I'm the safety expert now, he said, and for the first time since February, I saw him actually smile. We tried to have a normal family dinner one night in September. Nobody talked about the trial or the settlement or the therapy appointments. We talked about my college applications and Tommy's martial arts class and Dad's fantasy football team. We were all pretending to be okay, and we all knew it, but sometimes pretending is practice for the real thing. The last legal thing happened when Mrs. Finch's appeal got denied. Her supporters showed up at the courthouse with signs saying, "Parents lie, sitters suffer." We drove past without stopping because they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was Tommy finally sleeping through the night without nightmares. What mattered was Mom not jumping every time the phone rang. What mattered was Dad deleting the security camera app from his phone. What mattered was our family learning how to exist again after everything broke apart. October came with news that the documentary about our case won some big award at a film festival and raised $500,000 for kids' medical advocacy groups. The producers set up a video link so Tommy and I could speak at the ceremony from home since traveling was still too much for him. I kept my part short, just said every kid deserves to be heard in medical emergencies. 3 to 5 years for choosing Google over giving a dying kid his inhaler? The judge basically said, "Your brain doesn't work right," in fancy legal words while Mrs. Finch stood there like he was speaking Klingon. Tommy added that adults should learn to listen, and we could hear people clapping through the computer speakers. His therapist had been working with him twice a week since March, and by mid-October she pulled Mom aside to say he was making real progress with fewer panic attacks and better sleep, even though he still carried his inhaler everywhere and checked it constantly. Small steps forward were still steps forward. The 1-year follow-up appointment with Dr. Patel showed some scarring in Tommy's lungs, but his function tests came back good enough that she said he was strong, not just lucky, and that having someone fight for him made the difference. Tommy actually smiled when he said I was scary when I got mad, and it was the first time any of us could laugh about that night without crying. Halloween rolled around, and Tommy surprised us all by wanting to go trick-or-treating for the first time since everything happened, dressed as a doctor because they save people. He only made it to 5 houses before the anxiety got too bad, and we had to come home. But 5 houses was 5 more than we thought he could handle, so we counted it as a win. The state legislature passed a big childcare reform package in early November that required background checks and medical training and clear rules about different types of medications, and Tommy watched the governor sign it on TV. "We did that," he said quietly. "We changed things for other kids." His support group for kids with medical trauma met every Monday at the hospital, and he came home lighter each time, talking about how he wasn't the only one who felt scared or angry or confused about what happened to him. My early admission letter to the pre-med program arrived mid-November, and I wrote in my essay about wanting to be the doctor who listens to kids and their families, and Tommy helped me pick classes, insisting I take the emergency medicine one first. Mom hovered over Tommy when he wanted to help with Thanksgiving prep, but we all knew she couldn't help being overprotective now, and he made the cranberry sauce perfectly while telling us he was okay, really okay, and we were starting to believe him. One of the twins' moms called the weekend before Thanksgiving to say their boys were doing great with no lasting problems from when Mrs. Finch refused their medicine either, and she thanked us for speaking up because we saved other kids from going through the same thing. Thanksgiving Day came, and Tommy stood up to say grace for the first time ever, thanking God for me fighting for him, for Mom and Dad believing him, for Dr. Patel saving him, even for the prosecutor who got justice. And then he took a deep breath without any wheeze or fear and added thanks for breathing, just breathing, and we all breathed with him, deeply and freely, and finally whole again. Thanks for letting me be the little clever voice in your ear today. Seriously, you made this twice as fun just by hanging out. Catch you next time and like the video, it helps more than you think.